to answer questions. So whatever questions you guys have, I'm at your mercy. You've got me for an hour. And until I hear any questions, I'm just going to remind you of some resources that you have. I'm going to do the French Revolution tonight, and then I will do World War I next week. Oh, we have another person. Hi, Tanvir. And then I'm thinking on Saturday, I think it's the 4th, I'm at the State History Day competition, and so I think I'm going to have time in the afternoon. I'm just going to go to the library and maybe do another live broadcast from there. And then I can go over unification of Italy and Germany. So I think right now we just have Michael and Tanvir. So if anybody else shows up, just pop your questions down in the chat. And Michael and Tanvir, if you guys have questions, let me know what they are. So just a sort of context for French Revolution questions, it's probably worth just reviewing the idea of an enlightened despot. So someone who rules, I think my favorite description of this is from Frederick the Great. He says he sees himself as the first servant of the state. So someone who rules with the goal of using their absolute power, because they're still kind of seeing themselves as a monarch whose authority comes from God and divine right, using that power to do good for the state. So we talked about Frederick the Great. We talked about Joseph II from Austria, Frederick the Great from Prussia, Maria Theresa a little bit, and Catherine the Great of Russia, and a little bit about Louis XV, who did try to reform the French tax code. The Taille, if you remember that, tried to make that sort of more rational. With the other enlightened despots, we just talked about things in general that enlightened despots supported, which generally was like eliminating the death penalty. Joseph II and Maria Theresa tried to abolish serfdom. And then we talked, Catherine the Great did the Nakaz, the legal code that tried to basically inject some of the Enlightenment ideas into the legal codes of Russia. And that's how she earns the title the Great. But really, that's all just kind of context. So what is what kind of system is the French Revolution happening in? Catherine the Great ruled all the way through the beginning of the French Revolution until her son took over. And then he ruled for a couple of years. And then we have Alexander I in charge of Russia by the Congress of Vienna. So looking at France specifically, then you would want to look at the French monarchy under Louis XVI, and his wife then was Marie Antoinette, who was an Austrian, whose mother was Maria Theresa, and then Joseph II was her eldest brother. What did we talk about with Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI? Well, we talked about their frustrations with trying to have children, how they were so young to rule the country, how Louis XVI was a little bit inept. He was kind of quiet. He had these somewhat obscure hobbies. He was obsessed with locks. It's the blood of my enemies. Actually, it's just tea. The lock master. We talked about Joseph II giving him a little talk relating to locks, if you remember that. And then he really was swayed by his ministers, who convinced him that getting involved in the American Revolution was a good idea because it would counter the British, basically, because it would be a move against the British, who they had recent conflicts with in the 7 Years' War, which in American history is called the French and Indian War. And then hold on, Tanvir, I'll get to your question in just a second. So those were some of his weaknesses. Now, France is in massive debt. The Vlog Brothers videos on the French Revolution, I think, cover that idea really well. They're in debt not just because of fighting in the American Revolution, but still just remaining debt from the expenses going all the way back to like Louis XIV of expensive wars they had been involved in. So we talked about that massive debt as one economic cause of the French Revolution, and you had some stats on that in your lecture notes. We also talked about the political causes of the French Revolution, with the 3 estates in France. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everybody else. Now, be really careful. You can't call the third estate the peasants. Peasants are a member of the third estate, but so are merchants, artisans, the middle class. Like, lots of people fall under that umbrella. It just meant the third estate just meant you didn't have a title, so you didn't inherit some kind of title from birth, and that you weren't a member of the clergy. And even within the clergy, it was harder to get ahead without coming from a titled family. We talked about some of Necker's financial reforms. In your reading notes, you should have some info on that. That's the big economic stuff. Then politically, we talked about how the third estate, and in the Estates General, which Louis called because he was trying to fix the tax crisis. He's trying to raise money and change the tax laws and get the nobility to pay some taxes because they had wealth that was untapped. And so he calls the Estates General in May of 1789. They convened in May of 1789. It was called before that. It took a while to get it together. And before it convenes, Abbé Sieyès had written this pamphlet that was distributed around France called "What is the Third Estate?" where he asks, what is the third estate? And then he sort of asks it rhetorically, and then he answers, what is the third estate? It's everything. What has it been till now? Nothing. What does it demand therein to become something, right? So Abbé Sieyès is arguing for that the third estate and the Estates General should vote by head, not by estate. And that would be specifically how you'd want to describe that they wanted to vote by head, so by individual, not by estate. There were about 640 members of the third estate, and then 200 members of the first and second estate, so that would, or 250, that would give them a slight advantage. So that's the big issue there. The Estates General convenes in May of 1789. The third estate proclaims themselves the National Assembly on June 19th. They declare themselves a National Assembly. On June 20th, they arrive at the Estates General and discover that they've been locked out, right? So then they sign the tennis court oath. They form the National Assembly and promise to convene until there is a constitution. So tennis court oath is a term that you'll want to remember. This is going to freak out Louis, right? Because he sees this as a threat to his power. So he starts planning, or at least there were rumors that he was planning a coup to overthrow the National Assembly. So in order to get weapons to counter that coup or to counter that overthrow, the third estate will storm the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, just like the 4th of July, but 10 days later, and then 789 because it was Hungary. They don't really release anyone from the Bastille, but they do get a cache of weapons, and then it's this kind of symbolic overthrow of the king's authority, and the Bastille, the prison, being kind of a representative about this. Tanvir, we didn't really talk about Napoleon III's foreign policy. That's a kind of a different bullet point in the IB thing, so we don't. That's not a topic we covered a ton. We did talk about it a little bit in the context of Italian unification, like the Plombiers meeting with Cavour and Napoleon III. Okay, so I'm sorry, I just lost my notes that I was looking at here, so I got to get back to them. Okay, so anyway, they stormed the Bastille, and then the Great Fear happens on July 20th, 1789, the peasant revolt. They're afraid that the aristocracy is going to attack peasants and pillage their land. So the peasants kind of attack first, trying to secure their grain storage. And then that leads to kind of chaos countrywide. By August, in a series of decrees called the August Decrees, the National Constituent Assembly has abolished feudalism. They make everyone subject to the same laws, the same taxes, and eligible for the same offices. And then we talked about that motto of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, or in French, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And then the thing with the August decrees is that there were still feudal dues. So even though they abolished feudalism, they don't release peasants from the financial aspect of that relationship, and they still have to pay their landlord. So even though they're making these huge gestures, it's not as radical as it seems, and they're still protecting private property. We talked about the tricolor, the French flag, and what it's meant to symbolize, the Liberty Cap, the Bon Rouge. And then August 26, 1789, they put out the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And you guys read that in your article book. The Declaration of the Rights of Women, which you also read, is actually not published until a couple of years later in 1791. So even though it closely mirrors that document and is meant to just point out, like, basically all of these things also apply to women, it doesn't come out at the same time. There's a lot of things unanswered by the Declaration of the Rights of Man, though. What about slaves? Slaves in the colonies, were they... Right. Well, and free blacks in the colonies, were they also equal under the law? Could slavery be justified? If we're going to have religious toleration, does that extend to Jews as well? Did women have equal rights? A lot of these questions are kind of unanswered. And then October of 1789, the March of the Women, everything gets much more radical, right? A bunch of women demonstrate in Paris over the high prices of bread. And just to kind of roll back a minute, one reason that France was in a financial crisis in 1789 is that there had been a really poor harvest in the previous fall, and by the price of bread had gone way, way up. So women start marching for basically relief, like, help us. They gather a bunch of pikes and actually a cannon from the hotel in the center of Paris that was a government building. And they march all the way to Versailles, which is a ways, like 20 some miles. There's riots at Versailles. Some of the queen's ladies in waiting are attacked, possibly raped. They thought that the king was surrounded by evil advisors. So the October days is the start, or I'm sorry, the March for the Women is the start of the October days, which was this outbreak of riots and violence. And the end result of that is that the king moves from Versailles, they abandoned Versailles, and moved to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. So at this point now, he's living in Paris, and he's kind of conceding that something's going to have to happen. In 1790, the revolutionary government confiscates church lands, very controversial in a country full of Catholics. They start printing assignats, the paper currency, largely to, and they use were supposed to be backed by the land that was confiscated. They start circulating the paper currency. Ultimately, between 1790 and 1795, those assignats will lose 99% of their value. Now, you cannot use this as a cause of the French Revolution, though, right? It's what happens during the revolution. It's not a cause in and of itself, because it starts after the revolution actually begins. Now, if you were going to look at causes, I would say anything after Bastille Day, you were looking, or maybe the August days, you're looking at how the revolution changes, actions of the revolutionary government, not what caused the revolution, because we've got causes, actual event, and effects, right? But once the flames are starting, you can't talk about what causes the spark anymore. So Louis kind of begrudgingly accepts the Constitution in 1791. The king in that Constitution was given a suspensive veto, which meant he couldn't pass laws for 4 years. They had a single elected chamber, the National Assembly, and an independent judiciary. So they still had three branches of government. They had the king as the executive. The legislature was the single house National Assembly, and then the independent judiciary. It wasn't really, though, it wasn't great representation because they had this separation between active and passive citizens. So about a third of adult males were denied the vote, basically because they didn't make enough money. They then elect a legislative assembly. And in June of 1791, the king and the royal family try to flee. So this flight to Varennes, he's recognized near the border. I don't know if you guys remember, we did that ticker activity on that. And then the first coalition the Brunswick Manifesto is issued in August of 1792, which says that if the royal family is harmed, Paris will be leveled, right? So the Duke of Brunswick is a Prussian duke. This is going to lead to the War of the First Coalition. So France from 1792, and Tanvir, I think this answers your early question. From 1792 to 1797, France will face Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and Piedmont. And I assume that the reason you're asking that question, if I recall, that was a question from the IB exam maybe last year or the year before. I don't remember exactly which year, which is great. I think it's really great to go looking for old IB exam questions. So 1792-97 is a lot of Napoleon's success. It's actually 1792 to 99, I think you meant, Michael. Napoleon is a military genius. He's a tactical genius, so that's a lot of it. He has a lot of success in the Italian peninsula. He actually, though, also has some failures. The attempt to invade Egypt to cut off Britain's access to trade to the Middle East via the Suez Canal isn't built yet, but access to the Red Sea, that ends in disaster, and he's forced to retreat. But he's still kind of welcomed as a hero just for, first off, he loots a lot of art and Egyptian artifacts like the Rosetta Stone we talked about. So that's part of it. The other thing, though, is that the French had the levée en masse, the draft, right? So they're able to, France at the time of the revolution was probably the biggest country, most populous country in Europe. And they're able to raise a really big army. And they're not particularly, Austria's fairly kind of unified and powerful. Prussia, it has a really strong military, but wasn't a particularly mighty country. It wasn't very big. Britain's across the channel, so there's only so much that they can do. Spain didn't have a huge military to speak of, and Piedmont either. So in part, it's just that they're a stronger, more powerful country. Between 1791 and 1799, I guess it should just be 1792 and 1799. Napoleon will take most of the Italian peninsula, and they'll create these independent sort of French. So first off, France will outright annex land all the way up to the Rhine River. So that's now what's part of the German states. So basically, they take the Austrian Netherlands by 1795. And then 1798, 97, 99, Napoleon will conquer the Italian peninsula and then occupy Piedmont, Tuscany. Napoleon failed invasion of Egypt is in 1798. So I think that answers those specific questions about their successes. The rest of the big battles, I think, come with Napoleon as emperor. So some of Napoleon's domestic and foreign policies as emperor. So you have to watch these dates. This is where, and I think, Tanvir, this must be another paper 3 question. This is where these dates matter, right? So they asked for some successes of the French during the Revolutionary Wars of 1792 to 1799. That means you can't talk about Napoleon's successes as emperor. So you can't talk about Austerlitz, for instance. You can't talk about the Third Coalition, because that's all comes later. So you need to watch those dates. So no, 1789 is July 14th, 1789. You need to know September 22nd, 1792. That's day one, year one of the French Republic, which I'll get to in a second. You need to know November 9th, 1799, which is the coup d'etat of 18th Brumaire. And then Napoleon's first defeat in 1814, 100 days, and then his final defeat in 1815. So the Congress of Vienna finishes in 1815, which is a big turning point. Okay, so let me talk now about the radical phase. So the radical phase, once France declares themselves a republic in 1792, and Tanvir, I'll get to Napoleon in a second. I'm just going to try to go in chronological order here. There's a year of Girondin rule between 1792 to 1793. So that's kind of the more moderate time period. France is declared a republic, but then the Girondins are in power for a while. And then the Jacobins will be strongly in power by 1793 to 94. That's the Reign of Terror. And then Robespierre is kind of the final victim of the Reign of Terror, and he's killed in 1794. And then the Thermidorian reaction starts in 1794. The Directory, the new government, will be put in place by 1795, and that's from 1795 until Napoleon's takeover in 1799. So, speaking of all these political parties, you hopefully remember the Jacobins. They start as kind of a debating society, and then the sans-culottes are the working class. Make sure that you're, again, not calling them peasants. There's a difference between the urban working class and the rural peasants. They're all members of the Third Estate, but they don't necessarily want the same things. The sans-culottes share a lot of the ideals of the middle class government. Some of them have sort of Jacobin leanings, but they're less a political party than a kind of separate, I guess, just a class. So on August 9th to 10th, triggered in part because the Brunswick Manifesto was published in Paris, the Tuileries are stormed. So they're looking for evidence that the king was involved. They assumed that the king was involved in this. I mean, if you recall, I just said his wife had close ties to Austria. And so they assume that, somehow he's contacted them, and the Austrians and Prussians have promised to help him out. They do find evidence of this. By September 22nd, 1792, they abolished the monarchy, and then they passed the Decree of Fraternity. This I love. France is in the middle of revolution. They're fighting a war with Austria and Prussia, and they decide, you know what? Anybody else in Europe, if you need help, if you want to overthrow your government, we'll help you out. And then we talked about that old phrase, when France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold, because this will be one of many revolutions that start in France and kind of carry on to revolutions breaking out in other countries. So for the different political parties, you have the Jacobins on the far left. I'm not actually sure if my screen is flipped or not. I'm going to say it's not. So Jacobins on the far left. The Girondins a little bit right of center. The plain is kind of the swing votes in the center, and then the monarchists on the far right. My left is your right. Okay. Montagnards on the far left. Is this on the left of your screen? Girondins a little bit right of center, and then monarchists further right. Examples of other revolutions starting. So 1789, it doesn't so much lead to revolution as it leads to, war and chaos. In 1830, when Louis Philippe is put into power, I guess it's really when Charles X is overthrown. He's the youngest brother of Louis XVI, super conservative. He's overthrown in France. That's going to lead to revolutions across Europe and like Belgian independence, for instance. In 1848, France sneezes and Europe catches a cold. A revolution in 1848 in Paris will lead to the abdication of Louis Philippe. And then they'll have the Bloody June days. And then by December, Napoleon III is elected. But that leads to revolution in Berlin, in Frankfurt, the Frankfurt Parliament, in Rome, Milan, Naples. The revolution breaks out across the rest of Europe. 1968 is another example. Okay, so just to get back to the political, sorry, Tanvir, I think if you look at your old study guides, that list of terms, I've really tried to narrow it down, and I know it's a lot, but it's, a lot of exams. That's a place to start. Those are the terms you want to go. I'm just kind of trying to tell the story right now. So you want to look at those old study guides for kind of, these are the specifics I need to remember. Okay, the Montagnards are the more radical, the most radical Jacobins, with kind of a Parisian base, a lot of sans-culotte support, and they tend to be more focused in Paris. The Girondins are outside of Paris. They're pretty nervous about the sans-culotte. They see it as kind of mob rule, and they wanted more of a federalized government. Okay, Louis XVI is put on trial, basically for acts of treason, for trying to flee the country. They vote to execute him, but it's a relatively narrow vote. There were documents in the palace that proved that he encouraged foreign intervention. And on January 21st, 1793, he is beheaded. Marie Antoinette will be executed in October of 1793, so later that year. We talked about her trial last year, her son being forced to testify against her, and how horribly he was treated. Paris is in disarray at this point. So the National Assembly decides they're going to try to control all of this chaos. So they create these revolutionary tribunals. And the head of those revolutionary tribunals was Georges Danton. But the head of the committee that controlled the revolutionary tribunals was the Committee of Public Safety. And that's under Robespierre. One of the things that the National Convention does to try to control the chaos, to try to improve things, is they print more money to pay for the war. And we know how well that goes because the inflation by 1795 will be 99%. The Committee of Public Safety becomes kind of the government in name, even, or in practice, even if not in name. Somewhere around up to 50,000 people are executed. We also talked about Jean-Paul Marat. It's probably Marat. My French is not good. The journalist who was a big defender of the sans-culotte, I believe you guys called him Bathtub Boy, because he had this skin condition and spent a lot of time writing in his bathtub, which is where he was ultimately assassinated by Charlotte Corday, who was a Girondin. There were a couple of really ridiculous laws passed by the National Convention. The law of General Maxim was a price ceiling on grain, which then led to a shortage. The law of suspects basically made it so that anyone could be suspect. We looked a little bit at the different social classes that were executed, And the peasants and farmers were only about 28% of the people who were killed. The rest, were 28%. The nobility was only about 8%. So my point in this data is that even though they're meant to be kind of an anti-nobility, anti-clergy revolution, that's just a small percentage of the people assassinated, executed, mostly because if you were a member of the nobility, you had the ability and the means to flee the country. And those were the emigres. There's other resistance too. By 1793, the Vendée revolt breaks out in the Vendée region, protesting the anti-Catholic measures, protesting conscription. The Committee on Public Safety authorizes this scorched earth policy. So they're basically then committing atrocities against the French people. The question being, is this really a counter-revolution? Is it against the ideas of the revolution, or is it just against revolution? And I think it's more sort of an anti-revolution, anti-chaos more than it is anti the ideas of the revolution, though I will say that there's, a lot of support for overthrowing the religious policies. So the DeChristianization program was put into place because they see the Catholic Church as potentially counter-revolutionary. And everything at the time had to do with how much did you support the revolution, right? Making the revolution successful. Anything old was seen as illogical and not progressive. So the DeChristianization program was pretty popular with the sans-culottes, but not very popular in the countryside. One part of the DeChristianization program was the adoption of the new calendar, which starts on day one, year one, starts on September 22nd, 1792. They ban all public exercise of religion. They encouraged priests to leave the church. They destroyed a lot of religious symbols. And then, of course, Notre Dame is renamed the Temple of Reason. Oh, poor Notre Dame. I don't know if you guys saw on Twitter, but I posted a little spiel about Notre Dame and the history of it and the fire, and I was like totally distraught that day. And still distraught because I'm going back to Paris this summer, and I was going to bring my son to see it, and now he won't be able to. So anyway, another part of the DeChristianization program was they realized, well, if we're going to get rid of these old Christian traditions, or Catholic traditions, we need to have something else. So they create a new secular holiday, the Festival of the Supreme Being, which largely was connected to the sort of a worshiping, I guess, of Robespierre and of logic. I think some great annotations to review for this period. We had that long article in your article book by Lynn Hunt. It's got some fantastic details about all of the stuff that changed in the revolution, right? So, for instance, instead of using vous with everybody, they used tu. They were going to use the informal. The revolution had eventually increased the number of reasons that you could ask for divorce to 10 different reasons, like abandonment and cheating or adultery, abuse, and so on. Under the Napoleonic Code, which I'll get to in a second, that number was reduced to 3. So it actually gets easier to get a divorce, and usually these were pretty legitimate reasons for divorce. It's not just people divorce was not taken lightly. So when somebody was going to divorce, it was usually something fairly serious. But it gave women a lot more choices about and kind of economic flexibility to remarry, for instance, if their husband had abandoned them. There were quite a lot of interesting details in there about fashion, the liberty caps, David, the painter, asking him to design a national costume. They talk about the festivals of the French Revolution. So I would look at that, and I would also look at your annotations on Darton, Mona Ozouf, and then there's another short Lynn Hunt article. And the reason I mention these is all of these are fantastic examples of historiography, right? So looking at how historians are interpreting history. And I also have another, I don't know how to share a reading with you guys at this point. I don't know how much you guys are going to read, but I have a short 3-4 page article overviewing all of the historiography of the French Revolution, kind of how interpretations have changed. What else do we talk about? Okay, so the Reign of Terror then is really going to intensify in summer of 1794. The Law of 22 Perial, and I know I'm saying that wrong, simplified revolutionary trials to just have to decide between liberty or death. The accused had no rights. The question was just, are you an enemy of the people? So that kind of intensifies that law of suspects. There's a lot of British political cartoons kind of making fun of the radicals, the guillotine, the revolution eats its children, that kind of thing. Speaking of some specific victories, while all this chaos is happening, thanks, Michael, those little abbreviations help, or those little definitions. While there's so much chaos happening domestically, internationally, France is doing pretty well. They reoccupy Belgium, starting with the victory at Fleurus. Again, my French, sorry. In June of 1794. But by July of 1794, Robespierre gives this speech and basically says, you all are suspect. He talks about all these new plots and conspiracies he's trying to root out. They're rightly terrified of this. So the next day he's arrested, and then the day after that he's put on trial and guillotined. He had also, just as an example of sort of his paranoia, executed Danton, who was very popular, who was kind of beloved by the people, who was encouraging the National Convention to slow down on this kind of purge of the Girondins. And for that, Danton was also executed. That was in 1793, before Robespierre. So Robespierre, 1794. Just big picture, some things that lasting changes. The metric system is introduced in the Revolution. Slavery is abolished in the colonies in 1791. And then, I'm sorry, it's abolished in France in 1791, throughout the French colonies in 1794. They legalized divorce. If you want to talk about the impact of slavery, by the way, the Haitian Revolution, that's one big impact of the French Revolution, that because of chaos in France, it kind of gives more space for the Haitian Revolution to happen, is to my knowledge, the only successful slave revolt that I can think of. I mean, the only slave revolt that will lead to, a revolution and an overthrow of the state. Okay, so the conservative phase then starts with really with the death of Robespierre, but then remember, it takes a little while to create a new constitution. So during Thermidor, they're going to decrease the power of the CPS, and that's called the Thermidorian reaction because it begins in the month of Thermidor. Thermidor was the name of the new, the month that Robespierre was killed on the new calendar. So they're going to close the Jacobin clubs. They're going to decrease the power of the Committee of Public Safety. They'll reopen the churches by 1795 and allow freedom of worship. And by August of 1795, so about a year later, the new constitution is written, the Constitution of 1795. First off, during this time period, there is a white terror. So the white terror means that the people, the aristocrats, basically the emigres who have returned, a lot of them are starting to return to France. The people involved in the original terror are now going to be the targets of this white terror. In other words, a conservative terror. The inflation, though, continues. There's a lot of political corruption. There's a big revival of Catholicism. And they had this 3 branches of government again. So the 5-man directory, the oligarchy, trying to avoid a dictatorship. They had the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. So a 2-house legislature. They thought with the National Convention or the National Assembly that had not gone well. So you guys hopefully still have definitions on that, just like the Council of 500 is similar to the American House of Representatives. They initiated legislation, and the Council of Elders, which was only open to older men over the age of 40. They had to either be married or widowed. They only had 250 members, and then they either accepted or rejected the legislation. They were meant to be sort of old wise men. And then the number of people who were allowed to vote was limited to only about 30,000 people. So it's very, very limited representation. In April of 1795, there's bread riots again. By May of 1795, there's the revolt of year 3, massive inflation, the sans-culottes, a lot of women again, lead rioting, and it's going to lead to this crackdown. So by November, the directory is just distraught. They asked Napoleon for guidance. I think you guys read some excerpts from some of Napoleon's speeches. And by 18th Brumaire, or November 9th, 1799, Napoleon's done. And he stages a coup d'etat. He takes his opportunity. And then that's approved by a plebiscite. Now, the plebiscite is very, like, for instance, and this was in your, I think, Italian unification. The plebiscites under Napoleon tended to be like, well, we assume that all of Napoleon's soldiers would vote for him, so we'll just throw in 100,000 votes for him. So that's kind of what the kind of democracy is that we're talking about. So moving on to Napoleon. Do I need to put on the hat? Probably not. Okay, so he'd had a lot of military success, right? From 1796 to 1797, conquered most of northern Italy for France, and really kind of gotten a taste for governing at that point. They're going to suppress a lot of the religious orders in northern Italy. You can imagine how well that goes over. Italy, also a very Catholic country. They do end serfdom. They limit some of the noble privileges there. So that's a big deal. In terms of like revolutionary reforms. He's defeated in Egypt in 1798, and the French fleet is also defeated and destroyed at the Battle of the Nile. He names himself first consul. So the consulate is actually what starts in 1799. There were 3 consuls. One of whom was Abbé Sieyès, which was interesting because I think so few of those early people we talk about are still alive through the Reign of Terror. But he's named first consul. He proclaims himself then by 1802 consul for life. And then in 1804 just kind of gives up all pretense and names himself emperor for life. One of the first things he does is have a concordat with the Pope in 1801. Catholicism was declared the religion of the majority of Frenchmen. The Pope accepts this. He accepts to give up the land that was seized by France during the Revolution. And in return, France will do some things like restore the Sabbath. So under that revolutionary calendars, there were 10 days in a week, which means it's hard to keep the Sabbath holy if you don't know when Sunday is. Pope Pius VII would renounce the Concordat. So Napoleon had him put under house arrest, then had him marched, and I was just reading about this, somewhat brutally to France, probably tortured while under house arrest, and then Napoleon invaded the Papal States. Which I think is an interesting comparison to what will happen with France. Somebody earlier mentioned the lycée system, the educational reform meant to kind of search for the most talented students, the IB students of France, you might say. That was really bad, sorry. They did have to pay some tuition. It wasn't totally free, but it was meant to train kind of future bureaucrats. I'd say the biggest thing you want to remember about Napoleon in terms of domestic reforms are the Napoleonic Code of 1804, which is basically meant to revise civil law in all of the areas that Napoleon and France had conquered. So not just in France, but in northern Italy, in the Helvetic Republic, in Switzerland. It's meant to reform the French legal code to reflect the principles of the French Revolution and create one legal code for France and all of its territory. They're going to simplify some things. So the code is just divided into like personal status, property, and the acquisition of property and the acquisition of property. But it, for some people, it's for women, for instance, it's going to reduce the number of reasons for divorce from 10 to 3. I think that's in the Lynn Hunt article if you want to read that section on divorce or read your excellent annotations on divorce. It has a huge impact, though, because it's exported to so many areas and it's used as the like groundwork for a lot of legal codes in a lot of areas of Europe that Napoleon had conquered, but also that were just inspired by it. And then, I mean, if you think about it, like in Haiti, in the Louisiana Territory, all of those are going to be affected by the Napoleonic Code. Now, that famous painting of Napoleon crowning himself emperor, right? So he takes the Pope was going to crown him, and he was like, I don't need you. So he just takes the crown and puts it on his own head in that famous painting by David. And then there's a series of military campaigns are going to keep going at this point. So let's see. So women didn't really have property rights. I don't recall how that changed exactly in the Napoleonic Code. I think there was some question of that during the Revolution, but the Napoleonic Code specifically, that was one of the reasons that divorce was so important. If you weren't divorced, then the women still didn't technically own property. Widows had a little more flexibility, but you might look at the Lynn Hunt article to see if she talks about property rights at all. Okay, some big battles that happened with Napoleon and Napoleon as emperor. Hey, we have somebody else here. I'm getting to the continental system in just a second, because the continental system is super, super important. It's like key to why Napoleon ends up at war with everybody. So Napoleon is still really, the French are really still kind of in conflict with Britain. The Battle of Trafalgar, the rest of the French Navy is lost in 1805 over kind of control of the seas. They weren't able to challenge Britain on that. In 1805, the War of the Third Coalition starts. France will defeat Austria at the Battle of Ulm. It's just ULM. And then Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. He crowns himself King of Italy also in 1805. And then the Berlin Decrees create the continental system in 1806. And their goal was just to isolate Britain and promote, Napoleon's really trying to master all of Europe. So to promote French trade on the continent. This is going to obviously lead to continued conflict with Britain. Portugal refused to join the continental system. And so France basically asked Spain to help them conquer Portugal. Spain says no. So then that begins the Peninsular Campaign from 1807 to 1810. Now, I would say France was fairly victorious up until this point. The Peninsular Campaign, they start to get kind of bogged down. It takes that's where, first off, Napoleon doesn't lead the troops himself in the peninsula because he's busy being emperor, whereas he had in earlier battles and quite successfully. And that's one reason that soldiers were so excited to support him. But in the peninsular campaign, it's slow going, and it just takes a long time, and it takes a lot out of the French military. But they are successful, and by 1810, Napoleon controls most of Europe. So 1810, I think, is kind of the height of that power. 1810 to 1812. He puts his family in positions of power across Europe. So, for instance, his infant son with, I don't know if you recall, but he had divorced Josephine because she couldn't have any more children and married Marie Louise, who was an Austrian, I forget what her princess or something. Anyway, they had a son, and he would be eventually called Napoleon II, but he dies as a young man before he can really do much. He's made king of Rome as a child. And then in July of 1812, Napoleon decides he's going to invade Russia. And that's really meant to kind of finish his domination of Europe and also in part over the continental system. He's not called Napoleon II, King of Rome. They just kind of, that's why Napoleon III is Napoleon III. It's to honor that son who he died in his 20s of typhus or something. Okay, so they start marching towards Russia, and the Russians just march backwards, right? Like just avoid confrontation, retreat further and further back to Moscow, and drawing France further and further into the interior. So the weather plus the size of Russia is a benefit for Russia. The Russian nobles are abandoning their estates and basically burning their crops to the ground, which means that the French had to operate really far from the French supply bases, and the territories had been stripped of food. So normally they would have lived off the land, but they couldn't do that. Napoleon marches all the way to Moscow. By September of 1812, he reaches Moscow, and the city had been abandoned, and the Russians had set fire to it. And at that point, he's forced to retreat. So by early 1813, of the 100,000 troops that marched to Russia, only 40,000 survived. And at that point, the rest of Europe is going to seek the opportunity to form the sixth coalition. So the big ones you need to remember are the first coalition, which is that one, Austria and Prussia defending Louis XVI. The third coalition, which is when they kind of end up back at war after that initial sort of period of peace, I guess, under Napoleon as emperor. And then the sixth coalition after the invasion of Russia, when the rest of Europe's like, let's get him. So that the sixth coalition is, you don't need to memorize all of these, but basically Britain, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, a bunch of smaller German states. And that's going to lead to Napoleon's defeat. So then they sent him to Elba, right? And they had actually were going to allow him to just roll back his borders and rule France. There was some negotiation about that, but Napoleon kind of wouldn't agree to anything. So eventually they're like, fine, then you're sent to Elba. And he's sent into exile. He abdicates on April 11th, 1814. The royalists then take control and restore Louis XVIII. So that's Louis XVI's younger brother to the throne. By the way, who's Hello Kitty 1081? I'm just curious who else I'm talking to. Napoleon is on exile in Elba, which is not far. It's just off the Italian coast. Louis XVIII rules. And then by March of 1815, Napoleon has gathered some people. He basically escapes Elba. He steals a ship. Oh, hi, Caitlin. He steals a ship and takes it across the quick jaunt across the Mediterranean to the southern French border. He lands in France and he starts marching north. And people are thrilled. This is then, Europe is going to kind of by the way, most of them are the Congress of Vienna has already started. So by 1815, then they're like, okay, well, we got to finish this one last time. And that's the final coalition, the seventh coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, the big ones, Sweden, the smaller German states. They'll defeat Napoleon at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815. You can just remember 1815. That's that famous speech that Napoleon gives, right? When Louis XVIII sends the troops down and Napoleon says, I am your emperor. If you would shoot me, go ahead. And then they join him. So I don't know. That's about all I have to say about Napoleon. The only big thing I would add to that, you guys should have a handout on the big principles of the Congress of Vienna, which there's 3 big ideas there. The balance of power, right? To balance, make sure no one country gets super strong like France had. They want to kind of keep everybody even. Legitimacy, who's the legitimate rulers of Europe and how can we get them back on their throne? And then compensation. Here's all of the damage that was done to Europe and here's how much money we get. So you guys did the role play on that, if you remember. So France is rolled back to its old borders. Russia does quite well. They're given much of Poland. Prussia gets half of Saxony. That's going to be really important because Prussia's kind of going to be on the rise at this point. Parts of Poland and some other Germanic territories. They make a German confederation. And Napoleon's really important for nationalism. I mean, he brings all of these countries together. Germany had been, hundreds of principalities, and now they're brought together under a Germanic confederation under Napoleon, and they hated him, but it gave them a common enemy, right? But it also brought them together. So the Congress of Vienna is going to reestablish that German confederation and put it under Austrian rule. And that's really important for unification going forward. Austria makes out quite well. If they were given back all the territory they had recently lost, plus more territory in Germany and Italy. And those are the big ones. Britain gets some colonies, the Cape Colony, some colonies in Africa and Asia. Sardinia is given to Piedmont, so Piedmont, Sardinia. And Metternich is the big figure here. He's the conservative powerhouse, right? So if you want to kind of compare powerhouses, I think the Napoleon Metternich is an interesting comparison. Napoleon, military might, really expansive, and Metternich certainly trying to get what he could get for Austria, really trying to squash revolution, whereas Napoleon's like changing some things, but not like rapid change, but letting some things, some of those revolutionary ideas are put in place by the Napoleonic Code. Other change at Vienna that has a big impact is the condemnation of the slave trade, at the British kind of urging that. So that is about all I have to say about that. That was a lot. That was like 9 weeks in an hour. So I know that was a ton of information, but I wanted to get all that content in there so that I can save this and you can refer back to it. But really, I think it would be much more useful. Go back and look at your lecture notes. Your lecture notes, that's what I was reading off was my PowerPoint, making sure I didn't miss anything. Go back and look at your Lynn Hunt article in, what's it called? The Unstable Boundaries of the French Revolution is the name of the article. The Mona Ozouf article about French revolutionary festivals, the Darnton article about the possibilism in the French Revolution, and yeah, I forget what else. So guys, I hope that was helpful. There were only 3 of you here, so I hope that somebody's going to at least watch this in replay. Otherwise, yeah, that was a lot of time. So tell your classmates that this will be a lot more useful to them if they can ask their own questions. Do you have any other questions for me before I go? hope Tanvir's not, well, it says there's only 3 people viewing, so I assumed that was the 3 of you. I hope Tanvir's not overwhelmed by information and like rocking in a corner somewhere, right? Anyway, guys, I will see you next Wednesday at 7, and tell your class. I know this was a little bit short notice, but hopefully we can get more people here next week for World War I. I'm trying to recall. Yeah, I can't remember any other historiography. Oh, not historiography, but perspectives. Remember, perspectives doesn't have to be historiography. It can just be peasants viewed it this way, people in the city viewed it this way, royalists viewed it this way. It's like, think about social, political, economic, religious differences. Like all of those show multiple perspectives. So, all right, guys, I'll see you next week and hope you're all hanging in there. It's like the marathon, you're at the end. So good job making it this far and just keep muscling through. I'll see you next week. Bye.